This place should be demolished. Her scream tore through Pine Hollow's quiet morning like a siren. Barbara Henderson, our personal nightmare of a former HOA president, had been out of prison for less than a week, and she was already on my property, acting like the last 3 years hadn't happened. My pulse kicked up as I watched her from the porch, marching toward me with that same tight, furious posture I remembered far too well. She had no idea what she was walking into. After everything she'd done to this neighborhood, this was going to be satisfying. Comment below where you're watching from, because I'm about to show you exactly what happens when an HOA Karen picks the wrong neighbor. The black SUV slid into our cul-de-sac and eased to a stop like a hearse. Barbara stepped out with military precision, gray hair yanked into the same severe bun, eyes sweeping the street like she was taking inventory of her kingdom. Then she saw it, my cedar cabin. Her gaze locked onto the weathered walls and the gleam of the historical preservation plaque by the front steps, the same cabin she tried everything short of arson to erase. Her jaw dropped. For 3 years, she'd clearly been replaying a story in her head where my place was condemned and razed. But it was still here, and so was I. I kept my face blank and took an unhurried sip of coffee as she stared. The woman who once measured my grass with a ruler was discovering that her favorite thorn was right where she'd left it. The cedar siding glowed in the morning sun, the federal and state protections engraved on that plaque still outranking anything she'd ever waved in my face. For someone who'd built her identity on controlling every view in Pine Hollow, the cabin's survival was a personal insult. Her ankle monitor chirped the instant she touched the sidewalk, a flat electronic reminder that someone else, somewhere, now held the authority she used to think was hers. She glanced down, ignored it, and kept coming. Doors opened up and down the street. Mrs. Patterson peered out through her lace curtains. The Johnsons stepped onto their driveway. Newer neighbors drifted out, sensing the air pull tight but not yet understanding why. "Robert Mitchell," she bellowed, stabbing a finger at my cabin like she was serving legal papers. "This eyesore was supposed to be condemned years ago. I filed the paperwork. I scheduled the inspections. I did everything by the book." Barbara Henderson didn't know how to talk to people. She lectured, ordered, or threatened, wielding whatever scraps of authority she had like weapons. Standing on my property, already violating the terms of her release, she worked herself into a righteous lather, recasting herself as the victim of some vast conspiracy that had thwarted her noble mission to make everything match. 3 years in a concrete box hadn't touched her ability to rewrite reality whenever it suited her. The monitor at her ankle kept screaming. Her obsession with my cabin screamed louder. She stepped over my property line like it wasn't there. "You should have been evicted," she shouted, pitching her voice to the neighborhood. "Without my eyesore, Pine Hollow would be uniform. Ordered. Beautiful." The fantasy spilled out of her in a torrent, the monitor's frantic beeping rising to match her voice. Officer Williams arrived in under a minute. The monitoring team had been parked 2 blocks away, waiting for exactly this. His patrol car slid into place with practiced ease just as Barbara spun around, face flickering from confusion to outrage to dawning horror. "Ma'am, step away from the property immediately," Williams called, hand resting lightly on his radio. "You're in violation of your release conditions." Barbara opened and closed her mouth like a fish on a dock, struggling for words as real consequences finally forced their way through her rage tunnel. She'd been so focused on confronting me that she'd forgotten the one thing that actually governed her life now. The court order wrapped around that ankle. The takedown was quick and clean. Williams moved like someone who'd done this 1,000 times, pinning her face first into my rhododendrons before she could finish a sentence. The monitor went silent as her GPS status flipped to "in custody." "This is harassment," she screamed into the mulch, dirt streaking her cheek as she fought his grip. "He orchestrated all of this. No one bought it." The neighbors who'd gathered were too busy trading looks of naked relief to feel even a flicker of sympathy for the woman who'd terrorized them for years. The dictator of Pine Hollow was getting a taste of consequences, and no one was stepping in to save her. Backup arrived within minutes. Her parole officer climbed out of an unmarked sedan already holding the paperwork. wearing the expression of someone whose prediction had just come true. Barbara's accusations of harassment and conspiracy echoed uselessly off the houses she once prowled with a clipboard. When the patrol car finally pulled away with her in the back seat, Pine Hollow exhaled. Neighbors drifted off in pairs and clusters, stopping to reassure each other, shaking their heads at how fast karma had moved. I stayed on the porch steps, coffee growing cold in my hands, watching the street settle back into calm. I'd waited 3 years for this, planned for it, prepared for it. Barbara thought she was returning to the same frightened subdivision she'd left behind, to the same vulnerable cabin she'd nearly managed to erase. She had no idea how much Pine Hollow had changed while she'd been counting days on cinderblock walls. 3 years earlier, before prison, Pine Hollow hadn't been a neighborhood. It was a dictatorship in khakis dressed up in bylaws. Barbara weaponized rules. She walked with clipboards and rulers, snapping midnight photos, issuing $500 fines over mailbox paint. Fear did most of the enforcement work for her. The one thing she never moved was my cabin. The cabin was Barbara's white whale, a 19th-century cedar holdout that had existed long before anyone dreamed of Pine Hollow. When developers bought the surrounding land in the 80s, they were legally required to keep it as a historical landmark. Federal and state protection, preservation plaque, untouchable by HOA nonsense. "This is a homeowner association, Mr. Mitchell," Barbara had said the first time she marched up my path, waving a thick stack of violation notices. "Your little shack doesn't get special treatment." I'd shown her the plaque and explained, politely, that her authority ended at my property line. The look on her face was art. Naked rage tangled with the realization that something in her perfect empire existed outside her reach. What followed was 18 months of the most obsessive harassment I'd seen in my life. She started with the usual intimidation. Surprise inspections at dawn. Citations for grass a quarter-inch too long. Demands that I repaint everything to some imaginary neighborhood standard only she knew. When that didn't work, she escalated. Constant photographing of the cabin from every angle. Flashing cameras at all hours. Lurking in bushes. Clearly hoping to catch some violation she could twist into leverage. "You can't hide behind those federal laws forever," she'd mutter at 2 in the morning. Crouched in my shrubs with a tape measure, checking fence posts. When I'd wave at her from the window, she'd scramble away like a raccoon caught in the trash. Barbara turned harassment into performance art. What she never understood was that I was recording everything too. Every bogus citation, every threatening letter, every nocturnal photo shoot went into a folder, then into several folders, then into an archive. I installed a full ring of security cameras, some obvious, most not. High-definition proof of her creeping around my yard at 2:13 a.m., photographing windows, measuring distances, talking to herself. "Smile, Barbara." I'd call when I caught her lurking by my mailbox. "You're on camera." She thought she was building a case against my cabin. Instead, she was starring in an airtight case against herself. Her obsession with my property became the spark that woke Pine Hollow up. Mrs. Patterson was the first to quietly knock on my door after Barbara cited her for non-regulation garden gnomes. "I thought I was losing my mind," she whispered over tea at my kitchen table. She actually measured them with a ruler. The Johnsons joined the unofficial resistance after a $500 fine for using the wrong shade of black paint. According to Barbara, there were 17 acceptable blacks. They'd picked number 18. One by one, the people Barbara thought she was protecting realized they were actually her prisoners. They started sharing security footage, comparing letters, comparing fines. Bit by bit, we assembled a timeline that didn't just show harassment, it showed a pattern of criminal behavior. "We're not dealing with a strict HOA president," Sarah Johnson said during one of our late-night strategy sessions. "We're dealing with someone who crossed the line into criminal." She was right. Barbara made the classic authoritarian mistake. Assuming fear meant respect and compliance meant loyalty. She never grasped that every person she bullied became a future witness. Every family she threatened was quietly stockpiling evidence. The woman who needed absolute control over every visible detail of Pine Hollow had lost control of herself. and we had her descent into madness in 1080p. The incident that finally brought her down felt almost anticlimactic after all that. Unable to find any real violations at my cabin, she decided to invent one. One morning I woke up to find bright red spray paint on my front door. Condemned by order of Pine Hollow HOA, a fake citation was taped beside it, filled with fabricated structural violations that supposedly required immediate demolition. Really, Barbara? I said to myself, examining the mess while my cameras rolled. Vandalism and falsifying government documents. That's a felony here. What she didn't know was that my cameras had captured the entire show. From the moment she stepped onto my porch at 3 a.m. to the last self-satisfied photo she took of her handiwork. So when I called the police, they found her still on my property, busily photographing her own graffiti to use as evidence. "Officers, this structure clearly violates municipal safety codes," she announced, radiating authority she didn't have. "I'm documenting hazardous conditions to protect our community." Officer Williams, yes, the same one who tackled her into my rhododendrons this morning, looked at the door, then at me, then at the footage I'd pulled up on my phone. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for vandalism, trespassing, and filing false government documents," he said. The bewildered outrage on her face as the handcuffs closed was the first real step in Pine Hollow's recovery. The charges stacked up fast. Trespass, vandalism, harassment, falsifying documents, and a dozen related counts. Barbara's lawyer tried to spin her as an overzealous volunteer trying too hard to protect property values. The prosecutor countered with 18 months of footage and documentation. Residents testified. Story after story made the courtroom sound less like a suburban HOA case and more like testimony from a small dictatorship's truth commission. "Your Honor," the prosecutor concluded, "the defendant didn't merely misuse her authority. She turned it into a weapon against the very people she was supposed to serve." The 3-year sentence hit Pine Hollow like a cool breeze after a long fever. But her imprisonment left us with a different problem. Without Barbara's iron grip, the HOA turned out to be hollow. The remaining board members had been sycophants, not leaders. With their queen gone, the whole structure collapsed. Who wants to live in the neighborhood that produced the most notorious HOA president in state history? One realtor asked. The answer apparently was no one. Property values tanked. Houses sat empty. Pine Hollow started to look like it was circling the drain. That's when I started buying. I wasn't interested in becoming a slumlord. But with prices in the basement and sellers desperate to get out from under Barbara's shadow, I saw a chance to rebuild Pine Hollow on saner terms. I bought the abandoned houses, fixed them properly, rented them to people who wanted peace, not perfectionism, often refugees from other abusive HOAs. My only real rule was simple: don't make life hell for your neighbors. By the time Barbara's release date approached, Pine Hollow was unrecognizable compared to the place she'd ruled. Neighbors talked, kids played, gardens were weird and wonderful. The cabin still stood, unbothered and untouchable, and Barbara had no idea any of it had happened. Ghost Queen Barbara's arrest this morning was just the opening scene. What followed was a week-long demonstration of how utterly divorced from reality she'd become. Released on bail while the court sorted out her parole violation, she returned to Pine Hollow convinced that the rhododendron takedown had been a minor hiccup. In her mind, she was still the rightful ruler, delayed, not dethroned. Tuesday morning, I watched from my kitchen window as she tried to resurrect the HOA by phone. "This is Barbara Henderson, your HOA president," she said into her cell, standing on the sidewalk outside her house. "We need an emergency board session about the Mitchell situation immediately." I couldn't hear the responses, but I didn't need to. The calls ended quickly. Too quickly. 10 calls and 20 minutes later, she stood alone on the sidewalk, looking at her phone like it had betrayed her. Her shoulders sagged for a heartbeat, then straightened. Jaw set. Narrative restored. Wednesday, she moved to old habits. Door-to-door intimidation, clipboard in hand. She went house to house announcing ongoing enforcement obligations, referencing regulations that now existed only in her head. The show would have been funny if it hadn't been sad. Mrs. Patterson hid behind her curtains and let the knocking go unanswered. The Johnsons sat in their living room in absolute silence until she left their porch. The new family at 43 Maple listened to 2 minutes of mailbox lecture, then closed the door with polite confusion. Barbara noted each interaction on her clipboard, cheeks reddening with each dismissal. But she pushed forward on autopilot, following a script the rest of us had stopped recognizing years ago. By Thursday, even she couldn't ignore the differences. Identical deadbolts on nearly every house, suggesting coordinated security upgrades. New names on old mailboxes, landscaping that varied wildly, front yards that looked like they belonged to actual human beings, not a catalog. Her eyes twitched from object to object, processing each inconsistency, then shoving it aside like an inconvenient statistic. She moved through Pine Hollow like a ghost haunting a remodeled home, clutching her clipboard like a relic of a dead religion. Friday afternoon, the illusion finally cracked. Her master keys no longer opened anything. Not the community center, not the pool gate, not the mailbox cluster, not the maintenance shed. Each locked door was another tiny funeral for her authority. She rattled handles, yanked on gates, and muttered about conspiracies, as if enough pressure might make the locks remember who she was. They changed everything, she muttered to herself in the empty community center parking lot. This is a conspiracy. They're trying to lock me out of my own neighborhood. The idea that Pine Hollow might simply have moved on seemed too painful to contemplate. She stared at the chained doors with something like genuine confusion. For once, she looked less like a tyrant and more like a person who'd built her entire identity around a job that no longer existed. She'd never understood that communities can maintain standards by caring instead of being afraid. That people will mow their lawns and paint their houses without needing to fear $500 fines. What to her looked like chaos was just normal life finally returning. But Barbara couldn't process any of that. In her reality, order required her. If Pine Hollow was functioning without her rules, then something had to be illegitimate. By Friday evening, she trudged back to her house, shoulders rounded, clipboard hanging limp. She looked like someone carrying a heavy weight no one else could see. I knew that posture. Barbara wasn't giving up. She was regrouping. 3 years in prison had made her patient. It had not made her sane. Monday, the fake inspection, her comeback plan, surfaced Monday morning. I was tightening a loose gate hinge when she appeared at my property line in her old uniform. Navy blazer, crisp blouse, clipboard raised like a badge. "Mr. Mitchell," she called, voice cold and official. "I'm here for your mandatory annual HOA compliance inspection. You're required to grant access so I can document current violations." The audacity was almost impressive. She stood there as if nothing had changed, fully convinced that a blazer and a clipboard were enough to resurrect her authority. "Barbara," I said from my porch, not bothering to stand, "there is no HOA inspection scheduled, and even if there were, you don't have the authority to conduct it." Her face flushed the familiar storm cloud red. "The Pine Hollow Homeowner Association bylaws clearly require annual inspections," she snapped, consulting her clipboard like it contained state law instead of her own fiction. Then she made her first big mistake of the day. She stepped onto my property. Her ankle monitor started shrieking. For a second, she looked down at it in startled irritation, like it was misbehaving. Then she ignored it and raised her voice for the growing audience. "You all need to see what happens when someone thinks they're above community standards," she announced, sweeping a hand toward the onlookers like they were her jury. Mrs. Patterson stood on her porch recording. The Johnsons watched from their driveway. Newer residents, who'd only heard rumors about Pine Hollow's infamous former HOA president, came out to see the live version. "Your fence posts are outside regulation," Barbara declared, snapping a tape measure out like a magician revealing a trick. "And this walkway lighting violates illumination standards in Section 12 of the guidelines." She was inventing citations in real time. "Ma'am, step back. Now," a monitoring officer called as he rounded the corner, eyes on the blinking band at her ankle. "Ms. Henderson, this is a formal warning. Keep this up and you lose your bail." "He's manipulating the system," she shot back, waving the clipboard. "This is coordinated harassment." The crowd's faces told the story. The long-timers wore the tight-lipped expression of people reliving old trauma. The newer residents looked genuinely stunned that this level of insanity had once been standard operating procedure here. "Is she always like this?" Michael Davis whispered to Mrs. Patterson. She just nodded and kept filming. As the monitoring agent gently steered her back over the property line, the device quieted. Her credibility did not. "This isn't over," she called to me, voice cracking with desperation. "This community needs protection from people who think rules don't apply to them." The irony could have cut glass. A convicted felon on supervised release lecturing someone else about respecting rules. She turned to storm away and froze. Her eyes landed on the mailbox at 47 Maple. "Mitchell," she read aloud, baffled. "That says Mitchell. But that's not your cabin." She glanced from the mailbox to my property and back, confusion tightening her features. Then she scanned the other visible mailboxes. I could see the moment she noticed more unfamiliar names. More mismatches. Barbara had always memorized every resident's name, address, car, and kid. Now the neighborhood's labels didn't match the map in her head. "Interesting catch," I said mildly, offering her nothing more. After the monitoring agent left and the small crowd thinned, I sat back on my porch and went over what I'd just seen. She'd crossed from harassment to direct, repeated violations of her release order. And now she'd stumbled onto something else. Evidence that the population of Pine Hollow had changed, and that my last name had quietly spread across multiple properties. She didn't understand what that meant yet, but she would. Tuesday, the tenant Tuesday morning, she made her biggest mistake yet. Apparently, she'd spent the night obsessing about those mailboxes, because at 9 a.m. sharp she marched straight to 47 Maple with the determined gait of a woman about to crack a conspiracy. 47 belongs to Michael Davis, one of my tenants. He's a quiet guy who works from home. Moved here specifically because Pine Hollow had a reputation for being peaceful and HOA-free. Barbara was about to introduce him to the ghost of Pine Hollow past. From my cabin window, I saw her on his porch, arms windmilling as she interrogated him about the name on his mailbox. "You can't just put any name you want out there," her voice carried across the street. "There are regulations about identification, fonts, formatting." Michael stood there barefoot, blinking like he'd opened his front door into a parallel universe where mailbox police carried clipboards. When polite confusion didn't produce the confession she expected, Barbara escalated the way she always did. She pushed her way inside. "I need to verify you're the legitimate resident of this property," she declared from inside his living room. "Someone's been using Mitchell mailboxes all over this neighborhood, and I intend to get to the bottom of it." Her ankle monitor blared, but she powered straight through the warnings. Michael did exactly what I'd hoped any tenant would do in that situation. He called me. "Robert, there's a woman in my house," he said, voice climbing. "She says she's from an HOA and needs to see my lease. She won't leave. Can you come over here?" Michael had lived peacefully in Pine Hollow for 18 months with no idea the place had once been ruled by a clipboard tyrant. His crash course was starting now. I walked the 100 yards to his front door with deliberate calm. Barbara stood in his living room rifling through his paperwork, holding up documents like she was conducting an official search instead of committing blatant B&E. "Aha!" she crowed, waving his lease like a trophy. "I knew it. This neighborhood has been infiltrated by Mitchell Associates." Her face glowed with the thrill of a detective who'd broken a case that existed only in her head. "Barbara," I said mildly, reaching into my pocket for my keys, "you need to step away from my tenant's personal documents." Silence. "Your tenant," she repeated slowly. I slid my key into Michael's front door lock and turned it. The bolt slid back with a neat mechanical click. Right then, Jennifer Clark arrived. She'd been working as Pine Hollow's temporary property manager since the HOA's corporate carcass finally stopped twitching. "Ms. Henderson," Jennifer said, voice all business as she checked her tablet. "You are currently trespassing on property owned by Robert Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell is the legal owner of this residence and 22 other homes in Pine Hollow, making him the majority stakeholder in this community. The room went silent. 22 properties, Barbara echoed, each word its own little collapse. That's impossible. This is a homeowner community. No one person is allowed to own multiple homes. That violates the HOA bylaws, Jennifer finished for her, all of which became null and void 4 years ago when the association's corporate status was dissolved. Michael stared at me, at Barbara, at Jennifer. Wait, he said slowly. Robert owns this house? I mean, I knew I was renting. I just didn't realize. His voice trailed off as he connected the dots. Outside, people had started gathering, my tenants mostly. Sarah Johnson from 52, David Patterson from 43, Maria Santos from 38. They'd heard there was trouble at Michael's place and had come over the way normal neighbors do, to make sure he was okay. They weren't showing up as HOA subjects. They were showing up as a community. You bought them? Barbara whispered, staring at me as if I'd performed some kind of impossible magic. You bought the houses, while I was... She couldn't say the word prison with that many people watching. Jennifer scrolled. According to county records, she continued, Mr. Mitchell began purchasing properties about 6 months after your incarceration, most at significantly reduced prices due to Pine Hollow's reputation after your legal issues. Current ownership, 23 of 41 residences, plus several former common areas sold off when the HOA liquidated assets during dissolution. The math was simple. I didn't just own more houses than anyone else. I owned a controlling majority. Barbara's dream of returning to reclaim her regime had just smashed into the reality that whatever she thought of as her neighborhood now legally belonged, mostly, to me. Her own destruction of Pine Hollow's spirit had created a buyer's market. I'd taken that wreckage and rebuilt something different. This is illegal, she insisted, though the fire was gone from her voice. There are regulations about property concentration, restrictions on individual ownership, bylaws preventing. Those bylaws vanished with the HOA, Jennifer said gently. Pine Hollow is now a standard residential area under city code only. You could actually see the moment Barbara understood the scale of the shift. The streets she'd once patrolled with a tape measure were now lined with houses she'd only ever been able to regulate, not own, and now someone else actually did. My tenants weren't terrified homeowners. They were people who paid me to live their lives without harassment. Their landlord had zero interest in measuring their grass. Surrounded by those tenants and the manager who'd helped transition Pine Hollow out of her grasp, Barbara finally glimpsed the truth. She wasn't returning to a throne. She was coming back to a neighborhood that had bought its way out from under her. The ankle monitor on her leg suddenly seemed unnecessary. She was trapped in something much more permanent than GPS boundaries. We didn't need her. We never had. The spiral for anyone rational. Learning that the HOA was dead and the neighborhood's majority belonged to someone else would have been the end of the fantasy. Barbara wasn't rational. Over the next few days, she dug in deeper, clinging to delusion with white-knuckle intensity. He's lying, she told anyone who'd listen, standing in front of her house like a street corner preacher. Forged deeds, fake paperwork, massive fraud. Wednesday, I watched her cross the old HOA parking lot, marching toward the former administrative building like it was still her command center. Her ankle monitor beeped as she approached, but she ignored it, rattling the locked door with mounting frustration. This is private property, I called out, walking over. She spun around, eyes wild. Private property? This is the HOA office. It belongs to the community. I pulled a folded deed from my jacket, proof of the building sale when the HOA dissolved and auctioned off assets to pay its legal debts. She snatched it with trembling hands and scanned it, muttering about procedures and regulations, until her eyes hit the section describing the public auction process and the legally posted notices. All of it had happened while she was behind bars. Across the street, I heard laughter. HOA meetings, Mrs. Patterson said to someone near the mailbox cluster. We haven't had one in years. Don't miss them either. Simple neighborly small talk. To Barbara, it was confirmation that everyone was in on it. Thursday, my tenants started reporting direct confrontations. She demanded to see my lease, Sarah Johnson told me, half amused, half shaken. Asked if you were paying me to pretend to live here. Like my entire existence is a performance just to spite her. Michael called that evening. She's been standing across from my house for hours, he said, taking pictures, writing notes, like she's surveilling a crime scene. The woman who'd once used surveillance to terrorize a neighborhood now saw ordinary tenants as operatives in some Mitchell conspiracy. Friday afternoon, everything went sideways at the grocery store. Maria Santos called me, still shaking. She grabbed my shopping bags, Maria said, right in the parking lot. Kept asking about my electric bill. Wanted proof I actually live where I live and I'm not just pretending. Witnesses later confirmed Barbara's interrogation. Details of Maria's mail, receipts, household purchases. She seemed convinced that if she could just find one staged grocery item, the entire fake community would unravel. That evening, I overheard her outside, pacing in her driveway, talking into her phone, almost certainly to her lawyer. He's created an entire fake neighborhood, she said. Fake residents, fake leases, fake everything. It's the only explanation for why no one recognizes my authority. And I've found irregularities in the dissolution process. If the HOA wasn't dissolved correctly, all the property transfers fall apart. My bylaws still apply. My authority still stands. Saturday morning, she stepped outside carrying a thick folder like a holy book. I've found the irregularities, she announced to the air, then louder to anyone within earshot. Documentation errors in the HOA dissolution. Procedural violations that invalidate the entire transfer sequence. The Pine Hollow Homeowner Association is still legally active. All of Mitchell's purchases are void. She'd built herself an alternate legal universe where one technicality could resurrect her kingdom and erase the last 3 years. Watching her from my porch, I felt the first real flicker of concern. She wasn't just refusing reality anymore. She was building a replacement reality where any escalation became justified in the name of restoring order. Sunday, the final meeting Sunday afternoon, she staged what she clearly believed would be her triumphant return. By 2 o'clock, she'd turned the small park at the center of Pine Hollow into a makeshift courtroom. Folding table, portable microphone, battery-powered speaker, that same bulging folder of evidence. Attention, Pine Hollow residents. Her amplified voice bounced off siding and windows. Emergency community meeting to address the illegal seizure of our homeowner association and the fraudulent property transfers that have undermined our standards. People emerged from their houses like witnesses to a crash scene. Cautious, curious, keeping distance. My tenants came because they thought something serious might be happening. The long-timers came because they recognized the tone. Mrs. Patterson dragged out a lawn chair and sat with the quiet delight of someone settling in for a once-in-a-lifetime finale. I stood at the edge of the park with a case at my feet, laptop and portable projector inside, waiting. Barbara had dressed like a judge. Plain black suit, hair tight, steel gray rope down the back of her head, spine straight as a yardstick. She radiated the kind of brittle confidence you only see in people whose self-image is all veneer. Citizens of Pine Hollow, she began, voice booming through the cheap speaker. You have been deceived by a criminal conspiracy designed to destroy the legal framework that protects our property values and community standards. She spread documents across the table like damning evidence, tapping pages with a manic sort of precision. Robert Mitchell used forged records and bribery to convince you he legitimately owns 23 properties, she declared. But the truth is this. The Pine Hollow Homeowner Association was never legally dissolved. All subsequent property transfers are void. And my authority as president remains intact. The murmurs weren't agreement. They were unease. The sound of people realizing they were watching a public break with reality. Time to end the show. I walked toward the table at an unhurried pace, projector case in hand. Barbara, I said loud enough for everyone to hear. I think people deserve to see the actual documents you've been citing. The crowd shifted, turning from her to me. I set up the projector and screen with motions I'd repeated during legitimate community meetings for the past 2 years. "You have no authority to interrupt this official meeting," she snapped, clutching her folder to her chest. "I am the elected president of the Pine Hollow Homeowner Association. This is a legally mandated emergency session." She dove back into her monologue, throwing legalese around like holy water, trying to outshout whatever I was about to show. I turned on the projector. The first slide was simple, a scanned document bearing the Pine Hollow HOA letterhead and Barbara's own signature. "This," I said, as the page snapped into focus on the screen, "is the Articles of Dissolution for the Pine Hollow Homeowner Association, filed with the State Corporation Commission on March 15, 2020. I highlighted the relevant sections with my cursor. "This signature belongs to Barbara Henderson, acting in her capacity as president." The park went silent. Barbara stared at the screen, frozen. For a moment, it looked like she didn't recognize her own handwriting. "That's impossible," she whispered, but the microphone caught it, transmitting her denial to the entire crowd. "I would never sign dissolution papers. I would never terminate the HOA." Her eyes flicked over the text. You could see the tiny flickers of memory trying to bubble up. Flashes she'd buried so deep they'd started to look like lies when they resurfaced. I clicked to the next slide, a timeline of lawsuits and legal letters. "In early 2020, I explained, keeping my voice even, Pine Hollow's HOA was facing multiple lawsuits from residents. They challenged everything from due process on citations to misuse of fines. Barbara's own attorney recommended dissolving the association to shield the board from personal liability. The emails and letters appeared on the screen one by one, attorney recommendations, court filings, notes from strategy meetings. It painted a clear picture. Barbara hadn't been overthrown. She'd pulled the trigger herself on the very organization she now claimed to lead. "She signed these dissolution papers as a short-term legal maneuver," I continued. "The plan was to dissolve, dodge liability, and later reconstitute under a fresh corporate identity after the lawsuits were resolved." Her folder slid from her hands onto the grass. "I was protecting the HOA," she said faintly, voice no longer amplified. "The lawyers said it was temporary, just paperwork." Maria Santos raised her hand, then didn't wait to be called on. "So there's been no HOA for 4 years?" she called. "We thought it died when she went to prison, but she killed it herself first." An edge of laughter threaded through the murmurs. The irony was so sharp it was almost cruel. Barbara's composure finally shattered. "No!" she screamed, lunging forward. The microphone caught every syllable. "The HOA has to exist. I'm the president. You all have to follow the rules." She charged toward my projector setup, arms out. For half a second, I thought she might actually grab it. Then her ankle monitor hit a hard limit. The device exploded into panicked shrieks. Red lights flashed. Her steps faltered. Officer Williams appeared at the edge of the park like he'd been teleported there. Backup already closing in. Automatic alert. Automatic response. Barbara spun, face twisted into something almost inhuman. "It's all fake," she screeched, pointing at the screen. "Forgeries. Conspiracy." Williams and another officer closed in. She fought, yelling about fraud and forged signatures, even as the projector displayed a forensic handwriting analysis confirming those signatures were hers. Neighbors recorded every second. Phones up, cameras rolling. They were documenting the end of an era. As they cuffed her for what would be the last time in Pine Hollow, David Patterson shook his head. "Can't believe she did it to herself," he told his wife as they walked away. "All these years we thought we took our community back. Turns out she signed her own death warrant." Barbara hadn't been defeated by some brilliant rebellion. She destroyed her own throne with one pen stroke, then spent 3 years in prison fantasizing about returning to a kingdom that existed only in her imagination. Aftermath: the email from Marcus Thompson, my attorney, arrived Monday morning. Subject: Henderson. Disposition of new charges. Barbara's meltdown had triggered a cascade. Violation of supervised release, assault on an officer, destruction of monitoring equipment, public disturbance, incitement. Marcus summarized the judge's reaction in tidy paragraphs. The court was unimpressed by her arguments about residual HOA authority, he wrote, particularly once presented with evidence that she personally authorized the dissolution 4 years ago. She's looking at an additional 5 years tacked onto her original sentence, plus a lifetime ban from any involvement with homeowner associations nationwide. The lifetime HOA ban hit me as especially fitting. The woman who had built her entire identity on HOA power was now legally barred from ever touching it again. Her case had become a teaching tool. Civil rights groups had latched onto it as a textbook example of HOA abuse, and federal courts had used it to set precedent on just how far community enforcement could go before it crossed into harassment and rights violations. Tuesday, we formalized what had already been reality. As majority owner, I proposed the simplest structure possible. Pine Hollow will operate solely under municipal law. Jennifer read aloud to the assembled residents in the park. No HOA, no corporate body, just city ordinances and a short list of shared use guidelines. Where Barbara had wielded a 47-page rulebook, our entire framework fit on one sheet of paper. People signed acknowledgement forms, picked up copies, asked reasonable questions about trash pickup, snowplows, street repairs. Mrs. Patterson laughed out loud at one line. Mailbox policy, she read, grinning. Paint it whatever color makes you happy. After years of color charts and tape measures, the idea that their mailbox color was finally, permanently, nobody's business but their own felt almost rebellious. The meeting felt different from anything Pine Hollow had seen under Barbara. People argued a little, compromised a lot, solved problems without threats. It felt like a neighborhood instead of a tribunal. It's like learning to breathe again, Sarah said quietly. Wednesday, Marcus called with the final numbers from Barbara's sentencing hearing. 8 years total, he said. The judge specifically noted that Ms. Henderson shows no remorse and continues to blame others for consequences she created. He also mentioned that her public presentation in the park demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the legal system she claimed to represent. According to Marcus, her own public defender had tried to argue diminished capacity. But even in private consultations, Barbara had insisted the dissolution documents were forged, even after being shown handwriting analysis confirming they were hers. She was going to spend the next 8 years in a cell, still convinced the world was wrong and she was right, and that somewhere out there an HOA still needed her. Thursday, Pine Hollow's new chapter really began. People came out of their houses without scanning the street for clipboards. Kids played in mismatched yards. Gardens exploded in color and chaos. No one measured the height of anyone's grass. The change was as much in their shoulders and voices as in the landscaping. You could feel the absence of fear. She destroyed the thing she loved most, David Patterson said over coffee on my porch one morning, then wasted 3 years dreaming about taking it back, never realizing it died the minute she signed those papers. By Friday, the neighborhood had decided it needed one small monument. We set a discreet plaque near the center of the park. Pine Hollow established 1987, liberated 2021, peaceful since 2024, Mrs. Patterson's wording. No one objected. It wasn't about me or even about Barbara. It was a reminder. Standing on my cabin porch that evening, watching the sun hit the plaque and the kids running around it, I felt a quiet, solid satisfaction. Not the fire of revenge, but the weight of balance settling into place. Barbara Henderson had returned expecting to reclaim a crown. She'd discovered instead that she'd abdicated long before she'd ever gone to prison. The cedar cabin that started the war stood exactly where it always had, as it had for more than a century. Weathered boards glowing amber in the late light. Preservation plaque clear as ever. Protected by laws that would outlast any HOA, any clipboard, any Barbara. Pine Hollow was finally, unmistakably, at peace.